Hello watch enthusiasts. Now today on this episode of Story of an Icon, I'd like to talk about the Patek Philippe Nautilus and its full history. Now in this video I might not mention some of the gold variations on the steel models, only the versions which came in only one particular metal, simply because I do feel the video would drag on far too long if I did. But in this video I'd like to talk about the history of it from its inception in 1976 to today and how it's changed over the years, because this is a watch really from its name to its form that fascinates me. As it reminds me of the Nautilus, the submersible of Captain Nemo in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which is certainly an interesting book, and I really love that design. Now, the story of this watch starts at the Basel Trade Fair, when Gerald Genta quite famously sketched this watch in 5 minutes while looking over at the delegation, I suppose, of people from Patek Philippe having lunch. And from then, that design, this watch was born as a true icon of horology, with that particular bracelet and that eared design, if you will. And the watch was first released in 1976 as the 3700 model. And this was an interesting piece because it was different to anything made previously by Patek Philippe, obviously following in the design aspects of the Royal Oak from Audemars Piguet, hence the same designer, Gerald Genta. And one can see similarities, but certainly this does have an interesting history as one progresses through the years. Now, the 1976 3700/1 stainless steel Nautilus was fundamentally an extremely expensive steel watch, one of the most expensive steel watches, in fact, and really did start that trend of luxury steel timepieces. And it's often nicknamed the Jumbo because 42mm was rather a large size for the era. But then it was only 7.6mm thick, making it an extremely slim watch which could be worn very easily as a dress watch. That said, though, it was water resistant to 120 metres, which follows along with the nautical theme of this watch, which is certainly something I appreciate in this watch. Now, the calibre inside this watch is a variation on the JLC 920, a calibre also used in the Royal Oak, the original Royal Oak, and in this case was called the 28-255 in this case, which was a very, very slim automatic movement which fitted the case very well. Now, the relatively high water resistance of this watch is down to the case design, with those ears, and these effectively mean that the case back is hinged, and as such this watch acts as a sort of a monoblock case, if you will, and as the pressure outside the watch increases, so does the pressure on the seals in the watch, thus increasing the water resistance, in a sort of a similar way to some of the Omega Seamasters, which were able to increase their water resistance in exactly this way, which was again an impressive feat for the era. And especially in something which was fundamentally a dress watch in this case. Then the dial follows a very interesting aesthetic. It has this sort of squared-off aspect, which comes courtesy of that bezel, which again reminds one of a porthole in a ship or a submarine. And the dial has those iconic strakes across the dial with this dark blue sunburst fumé style of dial, with very clear indices, which were loomed in the era, and those very typical hands of this watch, which were very understated in this case, but certainly led to being a very legible timepiece. Now, in 1978, 2 years after the initial release of the watch, Patek Philippe considered the release of a white dial variant, but in the end this wasn't achieved, and in fact this white dial version was auctioned off just a few years ago, which was of course one of the prototypes of this timepiece. But in the end, Patek Philippe chose not to go for a white dial until 2012, when they updated the lineup with these white dials. Now, the next update to the Patek Philippe Nautilus line is the 4700, and this was a quartz version of the watch, which was 26mm and had a very different dial design, if you will. So it continued with the general styling, but had reduced loom and changed much sharper hands, and also came in at 26mm specifically for the woman's market, with a quartz movement. So a notable model, but it really didn't follow in with the major lineup of the Nautilus due to those design changes. Now, one model which I feel is very overlooked, but was very, very influential in the evolution and changes to the Nautilus, was the 1981 midsize model, the 3800/1A. And this was a 37.5mm version of the Jumbo, so it retained the same proportions, but was shrunk in all directions to produce a more compact piece for people with smaller wrists. But in this case it retained the dial design of the original and the date placement. The only real change here, other than the size, was the fact this is the first in-house model with the calibre 335 SC, making it the first in-house Patek Philippe Nautilus. Now this is a real change when one considers that previous Nautiluses has always contained the JLC 920, or at least a Patek Philippe variation of that, thus making this watch a very real step away from the standard Genta style of movement, if you will, or the movement known for being in his watches, but replacing it with an in-house Patek Philippe calibre, which I feel adds value to this timepiece. Now it's worth also pointing out that the standard jumbo, if you will, was discontinued in 1990 and wasn't replaced until the early 2000s. Therefore, there was quite a long period when this was the only option for those who wanted a steel model, which does make this again another interesting model, and it had a very, very long tenure as the sort of flagship steel version of the Nautilus. Now, one quirky variation added to the line in 1996 was the 3800 with Roman numerals and leaf hands, and this presented a very, very different dial layout where one had a simple black dial without the normal lines across it, but rather a simple flat dial, matte black dial, with these loomed leaf hands and Roman numerals, which are, in this case, applied to the dial. And this created a much more classic air to this watch, and did move the watch back towards the classic dress watches that Patek Philippe was so known for in the era, which is actually why the 3800 was so popular originally, simply because it really did return to Patek Philippe's roots as a dress watch manufacturer, where the standard jumbo Nautilus was rather large and somewhat brash in the eyes of some of the collectors. Now, other than this classic style of dial, which retains the same shape and date placement, the rest of the watch remains the same, with this very particular style of having the ears on the sides, the hinged ear, if you will, at 9 o'clock, and also that integrated bracelet with the polished centre link, which really was rather a beautiful change, I suppose, to a simple brushed bracelet. Additionally, with the 3800, it's worth pointing out that these bracelets did change rather over the years, whereby they started off having fewer links in them, and later on the links were shortened to allow more links to fit into the bracelet and allow it to flow better, which is a quirk that one sees on 3800s depending on the era you buy them from. Now, the next curious model in the Nautilus line, which is often described as an Aquanaut, when in truth, when it was originally marketed, it was marketed as a Nautilus, is the 5060, and this was a Nautilus with lugs, which is a peculiar creation, I suppose, and this is why it's often referred to as an Aquanaut. And it was, I suppose, you could say, the first of the Aquanauts, as it retained the 120 metres of water resistance of the original Nautilus, but didn't have that second ear on the 9 o'clock side of the case, but only had the crown guards at 3 o'clock. It also retained the leaf hands on the 3800, which was, again, a curious choice, but then it was in keeping with their design style of the era. And this came only in yellow gold, which is, again, the colour that one associates with this particular model. But of course this watch has lugs rather than integrated bracelet, which is again another reason why it's like an Aquanaut rather than a Nautilus. Though I felt it was appropriate to mention this watch, as it did contribute to the story of this model and its evolution. Now, in 1998, we see the release of the 3710/1A, which is, in my opinion, a watch which will become a future classic due to the fact that this is probably the last of the classic 90s style Patek Philippe's which were made by the company in order to make their watches more traditional in their aesthetics. This is one of the very last watches to feature the Roman numerals on the dial rather than the battens. But in this case, we can see the fact they're pulling away from previous concepts of having the leaf-style hands in favour of these straight hands, which are much more in keeping with the originals on the 1976 watch. In addition to this is the first complicated Patek Philippe, where within its steel 42mm case, we see the calibre 330 SC, which in this case has a power reserve indicator at the 12 o'clock position. Otherwise, this watch remains very much in keeping with the original 3800 with the leaf-style hands in the 90s, as it has that flat matte black dial, admittedly with a recessed subdial for that power reserve indicator, which in this case is a full circle rather than just being a short arc of a circle, if you will. But in this case, I think that the watch works very well, although many people have said that the symmetry of the dial is slightly off due to the offset positioning of that power reserve indicator, which I feel is a matter of preference, but certainly makes this watch a notable model in the history of this iconic style of watch. Now, what I feel is most impressive with this watch is the fact that the watch is still only 8mm thick, which is extremely impressive considering the very thick bezel by comparison to the case on this watch, attached to that hinge at 9 o'clock, and also including the complication of a power reserve. Now, the Jumbo returned in 2004 with the 3711, which is a very influential model, in that this was the first Jumbo to be produced after the discontinuation of the Jumbo in 1990. And this retained all the traditional design cues of the Nautilus from the original rather than the 1990s readjustments of the lineup. That said, the dial is a deep black in this case, but it does have those streaks going across again. So this is somewhere in between, if you will, the original blue dial style version and the a more sedate model from the 90s. But in this case, the watch retains the 42mm by 9.4mm case, so it's slightly thicker, but that's due to the new caliber 315 SC, which is an in-house Patek Philippe movement with the signature of Geneva and so on it to show its certifications. Where this watch really pulled away, though, from previous Jumbos is that whereas the original was a steel watch, and famously so, a steel sports watch that cost as much as a gold model, in this case, this watch only came in white gold, which caused a great deal of speculation as to the reason for this, and it's difficult to say why, really. I assume due to revenue of white gold models, since this was going to be an interesting piece released. But nonetheless, I think it would have been nice to see this watch in steel, which of course came later, just a couple of years later, a re-edition of the steel model returned to the Patek Philippe lineup. Now, the last of the 3000 line of Nautiluses came in 2005 with the 3712, and this is a very notable 42mm model because it's the most complicated of the 3000 lineup. And this version was only produced for a year, from 2005 to 2006, making it very, very popular among collectors of this model. And this 42mm Nautilus comes with a great deal of complications and was the most complicated of those 3000 line of models. So it has a power reserve with 3 red dots, you'll note. This changed on the successor to this watch at the 10:30 position. Similarly, one has a moon phase and a pointer date placed on the bottom of the dial, and next to that, small seconds, making for the most complicated of the Nautiluses, and featuring, in typical Patek Philippe style, a fairly bizarre arrangement of subdials on the dial, where they're not sort of quite centralised, if you will, but rather spread out around the bottom of the dial and the side of the dial, which, in my opinion, looks rather good and adds to that that tool-esque aesthetic to this very luxurious timepiece. Now, along with this watch features the caliber 240 PS, which is a movement produced for this watch with a micro rotor as its winding system, a gold micro rotor, which is a beautiful thing to behold through that exhibition caseback, which notably is the first appearance of an exhibition caseback on a Nautilus in this case. And this does really add to the historic value of this particular model by comparison to other variations in the history of the Nautilus. Now, one point to make about this watch is about the dial. The colouring on this dial returned to a blue fumé style of dial, but in this case featured a much more grey colour of blue than was previously seen on Nautiluses, which certainly was an interesting design choice, but was replaced a year later in 2006, where all the blue dials became much more blue in their hue and much more saturated. Now, for Patek Philippe, 2006 was the year of the second generation Nautilus, and this was a complete overhaul of the entire lineup, and this replaced the 3000 models with the 5000s. And the first I'd like to talk about is the most simple, the most basic Jumbo, if you will, and this is the 5711/1A. And this is effectively a 43mm re-edition of the original, and there have been a few design changes as well as a new movement, notably the fact that it now has an exhibition caseback, which is a separate piece, which means the watch is no longer a monoblock case, so one no longer opens the front with a hinge and drops the movement in attached to the dial, but rather one puts the movement in via the back, which to some purists was an unwelcome change, and I can understand why, because that was part of the original style of the watch. But it's just one of those adjustments, I suppose, that Patek Philippe felt they should do and make on this watch, so it's not really something to comment too much on, but certainly a change. We also see enlarged indices and modified and streamlined hands, which return to that more original style with that fumé blue dial, which looks truly wonderful in this case with those strakes across it. Similarly, the Patek Philippe and Genève writing has been raised somewhat to be placed closer to the 12 o'clock position than the centre of the dial. Also, the bezel has really formed the aesthetic for those ears, which are now much more rounded and show more of the crown, while having less sharp edges than the original, which I feel is a very welcome change, and one which I think adds to the aesthetic of the watch very, very nicely. Similarly, the font on the dial has been increased in size as well as positionment, which also is something which is echoed throughout the bracelet, where the bracelet has been beefed up somewhat to provide much more square centre links and an adjusted butterfly clasp, which now is more ergonomic and more comfortable. Housed within this watch, we also see a new movement with a centrally mounted gold rotor with the Patek Philippe logo, which is the 324 SC. Which is an altogether new calibre for Patek Philippe, and defines some of the measurements of this watch. And of course, the whole watch has been enlarged to the 43mm mark to keep with the times, which I think in this case is fairly reasonable, since this was always meant to be a watch that was larger than a dress watch, to be a sort of a traditional sports watch, as a dress watch which is wearable in the water, for example, or simply when going to a sporting event, for instance. Now, another model released by Patek Philippe in 2006 was the replacement for their previous complicated model, and in this case this is the 5712, and this features all really the new features of the 5711, but adds those complications of a power reserve, now with 4 dots on the indicator in red rather than 3, so small alterations. And also the numbers in terms of the orientation have been inverted on the date wheel or date subdial to make them more legible. This watch also has a new hue on the dial. It's a much brighter blue than its predecessor, giving it a far more Nautilus-esque spirit, if you will, and while the hands have been slimmed somewhat compared to its predecessor. And also that pointer date and moon phase indicator, the blue of the moon phase has been darkened, and also the entire subdial has been enlarged, taking up all the space in that sector of the dial, thus making the 6 o'clock marker have to be cut somewhat to fit, and there's the entire removal of the 7 o'clock marker, which was present on the previous model. Now, the movement in this watch is the 240 PS, which is the same as the previous model, with the power reserve, the pointer date, the moon phase, and the small seconds. In this case, it has remained the same. That said, in 2009, it was adjusted to a new regulation specification by Patek Philippe, in that it retained the same features, but simply was regulated more carefully, which is certainly a testament, but upon release this was the same movement as its predecessor. Now, one model available with either a grey fumé dial or a blue fumé dial was the new 2006 model, the Patek Philippe Nautilus chronograph. And this is a model which is an interesting piece, really, because it's a real move away from the traditional, very simple date and time Patek Philippe Nautilus. In this case, we have a chronograph function in a 40.5mm case, which in this case allows the watch to record time events, making this watch an altogether more versatile sports watch in the more modern sense of the term. Now, the interesting thing about this chronograph is that it features all of its readings on a single subdial at the 6 o'clock position on the central axis of the dial, with 2 hands to indicate the different readings, notably in this case hours and minutes. And this does allow the watch to be a very uncluttered chronograph, which is certainly welcome considering the minimalistic aesthetic of the original Nautilus as a simple, elegant timepiece. Admittedly a very luxurious steel one, but nonetheless a simple and elegant model, which is very much in keeping in the way they've designed this particular model. Now, one model which I always found was a model which is mostly ignored when Patek Philippe Nautilus is released in 2006 are discussed, is the 5800. And this is the new midsize model, and in many ways I feel this is the most true to the original piece, because at 38.4mm it is smaller, which is of course typical of the midsize model, which used to be 37.5, so it has been enlarged somewhat. But what's interesting about this watch is it features a monoblock case, behind which the older caliber 330 SC beats, but I believe that's down to the size of the new caliber. But the reason why this watch is so notable is because it was the last model in the Nautilus lineup to feature a monoblock case. So it does have an exhibition case back, but instead of the movement entering that way, the case back is actually dropped in through the watch, which means that the movement is still placed in through the dial side of the watch, thus making this watch more true to the original format of the piece, and does make this watch very interesting in my opinion. The next interesting Nautilus is released in 2010, and this is the annual calendar model. And this model features very similar design cues with a grey fumé dial to previous Nautiluses, but in this case now features, upon that caliber 324, a module which features an annual calendar, which means that what it will take into account the 30 or 31 days of the month to give you the month, the day of the week, and the date for the rest of that year, though it does have to be adjusted to adjust for leap years, or indeed for the 28th of February. When first released, this watch was also only available in a guise with a black alligator leather strap rather than the standard bracelet, which was only released in 2012 as a result of the adjustment of this model due to the popularity of the bracelet. Now in 2012, as well as adding a bracelet to the 5726 annual calendar, additionally white dials were now available for the 5726, the 5711, and the 5980, that's to say the chronograph. And these dials were rather different to previous models in the lineup, because of course previously the white dial had been considered in 1978, but not really revisited until this point. And now these dials weren't fumé style, they were a pure white, with that standard layout of having the ridges across the dial. But otherwise, the only real change apart from that was the fact that there were no longer quite the bright colours seen on, for example, the chronograph subdial, and also the hands and the indices now had black rims to make them more defined against that white background and make the watches altogether more legible. In 2014, the most complicated version of the Nautilus was released, and this is the 5980 replacement, the 5990. So this replaces the previous chronographs. And this is known as a travel time chronograph, whereby one has the chronograph function in addition to a separate time zone which can be adjusted via the pushers on the left-hand side of the case. Housed within this watch comes the caliber CH28-520C, which is an in-house Patek Philippe movement designed to handle these capabilities. But one quirk of this 40.5mm watch is that now all affairs are conducted via the caseback. The front is no longer hinged, as where the ear for the hinge used to be. Now there are two pushers to advance and move the time zone, along with those chronograph pushers being on the right-hand side of the case, in the same way as the chronograph pushers always were. Now, coming on to the final two pieces in this video, after nearly 23 minutes, we come on to the 40th anniversary models, which came out last year in 2016 to commemorate the 40th anniversary of this historic timepiece. And these are two electric blue dialed models of the Nautilus in solid platinum, which to me doesn't seem terribly in keeping with the original form of the Nautilus. And also, instead of loom plots on the dial, one has diamonds, sort of rod-like diamonds, which I think have received quite a lot of criticism without me adding to it. But certainly these were a very, very bold approach to producing two commemorative models in the form of a standard date and time one and a chronograph. Now, the date and time model is simply a redialed 5711, but the chronograph version is a new 44mm version of the 5976, which is a new chronograph size for them, but following the original format. Anyway, I'll conclude this video here with this picture of the beautiful original Nautilus. I hope the video wasn't too long, though I do appreciate it did drag on, but I do hope it was worthwhile. So thank you very much for watching, and if you did enjoy the video, then please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel and enjoy more content in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm on the Watch Guy, over and out.